Some men spend their whole lives building walls so high that love can't climb over them. Clayton Murn was one of those men, rich, feared, and more alone than any soul should ever be. For 30 years, he ruled 4 stones with an iron fist and a cold heart. He buried 3 fiancées and drove away 10 more. Then a stranger rode into town. Her name was Iva Brix, and she came down from the mountains with nothing but a rifle and secrets she wouldn't share. When she stood up to Clayton in front of everyone, folks thought she'd lost her mind. What could this woman possibly want with the most heartless man in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of 4 stones sat in a valley where the grasslands met the timber, where cattle could graze fat and men could build fortunes if they had the stomach for it. Clayton Murn had more than stomach. He had iron will, sharp business sense, and a talent for making other men bend to his vision of how things ought to be. For 32 years, his shadow had stretched across every street, every business, every decision that mattered. The bank held his notes on half the properties in town. The lumber mill ran on his schedule. Even the church bells rang in a tower he'd paid to build, though he rarely darkened the doorway himself. He was 58 years old that autumn, still straight-backed and strong, with silver threading through dark hair and lines carved deep around eyes that had seen too much and softened for too little. His hands were calloused from early years of hard work, though nowadays they mainly signed papers and counted money. He dressed well-tailored suits from Denver, polished boots, a black hat he wore like a crown. People stepped aside when he walked down the boardwalk. They called him Mr. Murn, never Clay, and they spoke carefully in his presence. The Murn Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of the finest grazing land west of the territorial line. His brand, a twisted M that looked almost like a scar, marked 1,500 head of cattle and appeared on deeds throughout the county. His mansion sat on the hill overlooking town, 3 stories of white-painted wood and tall windows that gleamed in the sunset but always seemed empty. Because they were empty. Clayton lived there alone, except for his housekeeper, Mrs. Talbot, who came in the mornings and left before supper. He took his meals in the vast dining room by himself, reading ledgers while he ate. He slept in the master bedroom where 3 different women had once slept beside him, though none for very long. The first was Margaret, dead of consumption before their first anniversary. The second was Anne, who died bringing his stillborn son into the world. The third was Violet, gone of pneumonia after just 2 years of marriage. 3 graves in the cemetery on the hill, 3 headstones he visited once a year on the anniversary of his first wedding. He brought flowers, stood silent for precisely 10 minutes, then walked back down the hill to his empty house. Between the dead ones, there had been others. 10 women had accepted his proposals over the years, drawn by his wealth or his dark good looks or the hope they could gentle something in him. But none had made it to the altar. Some found him too cold, too controlled, too incapable of tenderness. Others were frightened away by whispered stories that his wives had died of broken hearts as much as disease, that he was cursed, that he couldn't love because something essential was missing in him. The last engagement had ended 4 years ago. After that, Clayton stopped trying. He told himself he was content with his empire, his routine, his solitude. He woke at dawn, rode his property lines, managed his business interests, ate his solitary meals, and went to bed in a house that echoed with emptiness. If sometimes he woke in the night and felt the weight of silence pressing down, he pushed the feeling away and reviewed his accounts until sleep came again. His only real companion was Silas Reed, his foreman for 20 years. Silas was a decade older, weathered and bow-legged from a lifetime in the saddle. He knew every acre of the Murn Ranch, every head of cattle, every fence post that needed mending. He also knew Clayton better than anyone alive, which meant he knew when to speak and when to keep silent, when to push and when to let things be. The town functioned under Clayton's hand like a well-oiled machine. Sheriff Tom Brennan owed his badge to Clayton's endorsement and kept order the way Clayton preferred, firm and final. The banker, Gerald Hoskins, consulted Clayton before approving any significant loan. The saloon owner, Dutch Carmichael, paid Clayton rent on the building and never allowed gambling to get out of hand. The doctor, the preacher, the schoolteacher all understood that 4 stones ran on Clayton Murn's timeline and by his rules. It wasn't tyranny, exactly. Clayton paid fair wages, kept his business dealings mostly honest, and occasionally showed flashes of generosity that surprised people. When the schoolhouse needed a new roof, he paid for it without being asked. When old Pete Garrison broke his leg and couldn't work his small farm, Clayton quietly sent men to bring in his harvest. These acts weren't announced or celebrated. They simply happened, and people learned not to make too much of them. But fairness and occasional charity weren't the same as warmth. Clayton commanded respect, but not affection. People nodded to him, but didn't invite him to their homes. They appreciated his contributions to the town, but didn't trust him with their hearts or their secrets. He was the richest man in 3 counties and the loneliest, though he would never have admitted it. The autumn of 1881 arrived with golden light and 8 cool winds carrying the smell of pine from the high country. Leaves turned yellow on the cottonwoods along the creek. Cattle grew fat on late grass. Clayton supervised the roundup and the selection of steers for the Denver market. Everything proceeded as it had for 30 years, orderly and profitable and predictable. Then Iva Brix rode into town. She came down from the mountain road on a Tuesday morning, sitting easy on a rangy sorrel mare that had seen hard use but was well cared for. She wore men's canvas pants, a wool shirt faded from many washings, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. A bedroll and pack were tied behind her saddle, and a Winchester rifle rested in its scabbard within easy reach. She was somewhere around 50 years old, lean and weathered like someone who'd spent most of her life outdoors. Her face was lined but handsome in a strong-boned way, and her eyes, when you could see them under that hat, were the clear grey of storm clouds over the peaks. Her hands on the reins were capable and scarred. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd dealt with trouble before and wasn't especially afraid of finding it again. She rode straight to the land office without stopping to ask directions, tied her horse to the rail, and went inside. The clerk, a nervous young man named Henry Walsh, looked up from his records and blinked in surprise. Women didn't usually come to the land office, and they certainly didn't come alone wearing trail clothes and carrying rifles. "Help you, ma'am?" Henry managed. "I need to see the records for Township 12. Range 6, Iva said. Her voice was low and calm, with the hint of an accent that suggested she'd grown up speaking something other than English before she'd learned it. Specifically the parcel in sections 14 and 15, up near the timberline. Henry hesitated. "That's all Murn land, ma'am. Has been for 20 years or more. I'd still like to see the records." Henry pulled out the plat books and spread them on the counter. Eva studied them carefully, tracing boundaries with one finger. After several minutes, she nodded, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Who do I speak to about contesting a deed?" she asked. Henry's eyes went wide. "Contesting? You mean you think there's an error?" "I mean I have a prior claim to that land, a legitimate one. I'd like to file the proper paperwork." "Ma'am, that's Clayton Murn's property. He's owned it since 1861, according to these records. My claim predates his." She pulled a folded document from inside her shirt, protected by oilcloth. "This is a deed dated 1851, properly witnessed, never recorded. It belonged to my mother's family." Henry stared at the paper like it might bite him. "Ma'am, I don't have the authority to. You need to speak with Judge Ashford, or maybe you should talk to Mr. Murn directly." I intend to talk to Mr. Murn, Iva said. But first I want this claim officially filed. Can you do that? Or do I need to ride to the county seat? Henry swallowed hard. I can file it. But ma'am, Mr. Murn isn't going to. I mean, nobody challenges. Then it's time somebody did. Iva's tone wasn't angry or aggressive. She simply stated a fact. How long will the filing take? I need to make copies, verify the signatures recorded in the books. 2 hours, maybe 3. I'll be at the boarding house. Send word when it's done. She walked out, leaving Henry staring at the old deed with a sense of impending catastrophe. Within an hour, word had spread through town. By noon, everyone knew that a strange mountain woman had filed a claim against Clayton Murn's land. By early afternoon, Clayton himself knew. He was in his study when Silas brought the news, his boots muddy from riding the North Range. The foreman stood in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands, a sure sign of trouble. "You're going to want to hear this, Clay." Clayton looked up from his correspondence. "Hear what? Woman rode in this morning, filed a land claim against your high country parcel up near Bridger Creek." Clayton set down his pen very carefully. "Someone filed a claim? Against my land? That's what Henry Walsh says. He's about ready to wet himself over it. Woman had an old deed, dated before yours. Says it belonged to her mother's people. What's her name?" "Iva Brix." Clayton repeated the name slowly. "Brix. I don't know any Brix family. Neither does anyone else. She says she's from the mountains, looks it too tough as rawhide, and about as friendly." Clayton stood and reached for his coat. "Where is she now?" "Temperance, Sloane's boarding house." Clayton headed for the door, his jaw set in a hard line. Nobody challenged his property rights. Nobody. Whatever game this woman thought she was playing, it would end quickly and decisively. He'd built his empire on making sure people understood where the boundaries were and what happened when you crossed them. But as he walked down the hill toward town, something nagged at him. The name Bridger tickled at his memory. Bridger Creek had been named for an old family that used to run cattle up in that country, back before Clayton had come to Four Stones. He'd bought that land from a bank that had foreclosed on it. Everything had been legal and proper, hadn't it? Clayton found Iva Brix on the front porch of Temperance Sloane's boarding house, sitting in one of the rockers with a cup of coffee balanced on the arm. She didn't stand when he approached, didn't show any of the deference that most people offered automatically. She just looked at him with those steady grey eyes and waited. "Miss Brix, I'm Clayton Murn. I know who you are, Mr. Murn. Then you know I own the land you're making claims against. I know you think you do." She took a sip of her coffee. "But thinking a thing doesn't make it true." Clayton felt his temper stir, that old familiar heat that had gotten him into trouble when he was younger. He'd learned to control it over the years, to channel it into cold authority instead of hot anger. "I have a deed registered with the county, purchased fair and square in 1861. I've paid taxes on that land for 20 years. What exactly is your claim?" Iva set down her coffee and pulled the oilcloth-wrapped document from her coat pocket. She unfolded it carefully and handed it to him. "This deed was issued to my grandfather, Samuel Bridger, in 1851. It was witnessed and signed by the territorial land agent. It was never recorded because my grandfather didn't trust government offices after what happened to his family back east. But that doesn't make it invalid." Clayton studied the document. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, but the writing was clear. The legal description matched his property exactly. The signatures looked authentic, though he'd need an expert to be certain. "Even if this is genuine," he said slowly, "it's been 40 years. Where's your grandfather now? Where's your family been all this time? My grandfather died in 1855. My grandmother raised my mother and her sister in the high country. My mother married a man named Thomas Brix and stayed in the mountains her whole life. She died 2 years ago and left me that deed. She told me to come down and claim what was rightfully ours." Something in her voice, when she mentioned Thomas Brix, made Clayton look up sharply. The name meant something, tickled at the edges of memory. Thomas Brix. Thomas Brix. Where had he heard that name? Then it came to him, sudden and uncomfortable. Thomas Brix had been a young ranch hand who'd worked for him briefly in the late 1842. Clayton had fired him for theft tools, had gone missing from the tack room, and Thomas had been the newest hire, the obvious suspect. The young man had protested his innocence, but Clayton hadn't listened. He'd sent Thomas packing with nothing but his bedroll and a warning, never to show his face in 4 stones again. Clayton's jaw tightened. Your father was Thomas Brix, the one who worked for me? The one you accused of theft and ran out of town, you mean? Yes, that was my father. He was guilty. He was innocent. The real thief confessed years later, after my father was dead. But you didn't wait to be sure, did you? You just decided he was guilty and threw him out. I ran a business. I couldn't afford to keep a thief on my payroll. So you destroyed an innocent man's reputation and livelihood because it was convenient. Iva's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. My father and mother tried to come back once, tried to clear his name, but by then you were too important, too powerful. No one would listen to them. So they went back to the mountains and lived hard lives, scratching by on hunting and trapping and whatever work they could find. My father died in a mining accident when I was 12 years old. My mother never really recovered from it. Clayton felt something twist in his chest, an uncomfortable sensation he didn't want to examine. That's unfortunate, but it has nothing to do with this land claim. Doesn't it? Iva stood now, and though she was smaller than him, she seemed to fill the space. You took everything from my father based on a guess. You built your empire on other people's ruin. Now I'm here to take back what's mine. Not just the land, Mr. Murn. The truth. The truth is, I bought that property legally, from a bank that foreclosed on land that was never properly theirs. My family never defaulted on anything. We never sold it. We just stopped coming down from the mountains because we weren't welcome here anymore. Clayton's mind raced. He needed to get back to his office, pull the files, check the chain of title. But more than that, he needed to understand what this woman really wanted. The land itself wasn't particularly valuable. It was high country, good for summer grazing, but nothing special. If she just wanted money, he could pay her off and be done with it. What is it you're after, Miss Brix? Compensation? Because if this is about money, it's not about money. She cut him off sharply. It's about justice. It's about setting things right. It's about making you see that your actions have consequences that ripple out farther than you know. People were gathering on the street now, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Clayton was acutely aware of 24 pairs of eyes watching this confrontation. No one had ever spoken to him this way in public. No one had ever challenged him so directly. You're making serious accusations, he said quietly, letting ice creep into his voice. You should be careful about that. Is that a threat, Mr. Murn? It's a statement of fact. If you're going to challenge my property rights, you'd better have more than an old piece of paper and a family grudge. Oh, I have plenty more. Iva stepped closer, and he caught the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to her clothes. I have records. I have witnesses to what you did to my father. I have proof that the bank's foreclosure was improper. And I have time, Mr. Murn, all the time in the world. I'm not going anywhere until this is settled. She moved past him down the steps, heading toward the mercantile. The crowd parted for her like water around a stone. Clayton stood on the porch, his fist clenched around her deed, watching her walk away. Temperance Sloane appeared in the doorway behind him. She was in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, one of the few people in town who'd known Clayton since before he'd become powerful. That was quite a show, she said mildly. Stay out of this, Temperance. Can't. She's renting a room from me. Nice woman, actually. Quiet, polite, pays in advance. Clayton turned to look at her. You know what she's trying to do? I know what you did to Thomas Brix. I remember that boy. He was honest as sunrise, and you ruined him because it was easier than finding out the truth. Temperance crossed her arms. Maybe it's time someone stood up to you, Clayton. Maybe it's overdue. She went back inside, leaving him alone on the porch with a crowd of townspeople staring and a sensation he hadn't felt in 30 years, uncertainty. That night, Clayton sat in his study going through old files. He found the deed to the high country parcel, examined the chain of title. The bank had foreclosed in 1860 on property belonging to the Bridger family for unpaid taxes. He'd purchased it at auction in 1861. Everything looked proper. But as he dug deeper, he found discrepancies. The tax notices had been sent to an address in town where the Bridgers hadn't lived in years. There was no record of anyone attempting to contact them at their actual location. The foreclosure had happened fast, suspiciously fast. And there, at the bottom of a file box, he found something else. A letter from his lawyer, at the time, written in 1860. Regarding the Bridger property you inquired about, I can arrange for the bank to accelerate the foreclosure process if you're willing to compensate them for any administrative complications. The family is absent and unlikely to contest. Clayton stared at the letter, his stomach sinking. He'd forgotten this. Or maybe he'd deliberately not remembered it. He'd wanted that land because it controlled water rights to a larger parcel. So he'd greased the wheels, made sure the foreclosure happened quickly, made sure no one looked too hard at whether it was proper. He'd told himself it was just business. The Bridgers were gone, probably never coming back. The land was going to waste, he could put it to better use. But Thomas Brix had been married to a Bridger. That's why the young man had been in 4 Stones in the first place. He'd come down from the mountains with his wife, trying to make a better life, and Clayton had destroyed that chance. First by falsely accusing him of theft, then by stealing his wife's family land. Clayton poured himself a whiskey and stood at the window, looking out at the town he controlled. For the first time in decades, he felt something like shame. Iva Brix wasn't just here for land, she was here for an accounting, and he wasn't sure he had any defense. Clayton hired a private investigator from Denver. He told himself it was to verify Iva's story, to check whether her deed was authentic and her claims legitimate. But part of him needed to know who this woman really was, what drove her, whether there was any way to resolve this without losing face or property. The investigator's name was Marcus Webb, a former Pinkerton man who now worked private cases for wealthy clients. He arrived 3 days after Iva's confrontation with Clayton and spent a week making quiet inquiries, sending telegrams, reviewing records. Meanwhile, Iva settled into life in 4 Stones. She took a room at Temperance's boarding house, paid a month in advance, and went about her business with a calm that seemed to unsettle people more than anger would have. She visited the mercantile for supplies, attended Sunday service at the church, and sat on the boarding house porch in the evenings, reading by lamplight. She didn't cause trouble. She didn't make speeches or rally people against Clayton. She simply existed in town, a quiet presence that reminded everyone a challenge had been made and was waiting to be answered. Temperance Sloane took a liking to her. The 2 women could often be seen drinking coffee together on the porch, talking in low voices. Other women in town were more cautious. Clayton Murn's displeasure was nothing to invite, but curiosity drew them gradually closer. Iva helped at the church social, volunteered to mend choir robes, and spoke kindly to the children who gathered to stare at the strange mountain woman. One afternoon, Clayton arranged to accidentally encounter her at the general store. He was examining saddle blankets when she came in to buy coffee and flour. He nodded to her formally. Miss Brix, Mr. Murn. Her tone was equally neutral. Settling in well, I see. Well enough. It's a nice town, good people mostly. The qualifier wasn't lost on him. He set down the blanket he'd been examining. I've been reviewing the documents. Your deed appears authentic. It is authentic. Even so, adverse possession law would suggest that after 20 years of continuous occupation and tax payment, the property legally transferred to me. That assumes the original foreclosure was valid. It wasn't. My family never received proper notice. The process was deliberately rushed. She selected a pound of coffee beans and brought them to the counter. I have correspondence proving you arranged for that acceleration. Clayton felt heat rise in his face. You've been going through my files? I've been going through public records and old newspaper archives. A lawyer was quite thorough in his documentation. Too thorough, as it happens. The store owner, old Sam Henderson, was trying very hard to look like he wasn't listening while hanging on every word. Clayton lowered his voice. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. Why? Afraid the town might learn their great benefactor built his empire on other people's backs? I'm trying to be reasonable. Reasonable would have been not stealing my family's land in the first place. Iva paid for her purchases and picked up the small bag. I'll see you at the hearing, Mr. Murn. She left, and Clayton stood there, feeling the weight of Sam Henderson's careful attention. The whole town would know about this conversation within the hour. That evening, Marcus Webb returned with his report. Clayton read it in his study while the investigator waited. Iva Brix was exactly who she claimed to be. Born in 1,831 inches the high mountains, daughter of Thomas Brix and Louisa Bridger Brix, raised by her mother and grandmother after her father's death. Known in the mountain communities as an honest guide and skilled hunter. No debts, no criminal record, no history of dishonesty. But there was a gap in the records. Between 1,849 and 1,856, there was no trace of her. No employment records, no tax records, nothing. What happened during those years? Clayton asked. Webb shook his head. Can't say for certain. I found one reference a woman matching her description was seen at a mission school in Montana Territory during that period. But the records were lost in a fire. Whatever she was doing, she doesn't talk about it. After Webb left, Clayton sat alone with the report. He found himself oddly drawn to the mystery of Iva Brix's missing years. What had happened to her? Where had she been? He caught himself and pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. What mattered was the land dispute and how to resolve it without damaging his reputation or holdings. But late that night, unable to sleep, he found himself at the cemetery on the hill. He stood before Violet's grave, the third wife he'd buried. Her headstone read, Violet Bridger Murn, 1,842 to 1,869, beloved wife, Bridger. The name struck him like a fist. Violet had been a Bridger. He'd known that, of course, but he'd never connected it to the land, to Thomas Brix, to any of it. Violet's family had come from the high country originally. She'd mentioned having a sister who'd run away years before, who'd married against the family's wishes. A sister named Louisa. Clayton's breath caught. Louisa Bridger had married Thomas Brix, which meant Violet and Louisa were sisters, which meant Iva Brix was Violet's niece. He stood in the darkness, staring at his dead wife's grave, and felt the full weight of what he'd done. He'd falsely accused and driven off Thomas Brix. He'd stolen the Bridger family land. And then he'd married Violet, never knowing or never acknowledging the connection. Had Violet known? Had she known what he'd done to her sister's husband, to her family's property? He remembered her now in those final weeks before pneumonia took her. She'd been sad, withdrawn, staring out windows at the mountains. He'd attributed it to illness, but maybe it had been something else. Maybe she'd learned the truth and couldn't bear to confront him. Maybe she'd died knowing she'd married the man who'd destroyed her family. Clayton walked back down the hill as dawn broke, feeling older than his 58 years. The investigator's report had given him ammunition to use against Iva Brix if he chose. But it had also given him something else, the terrible understanding that his sins were deeper and more tangled than he'd allowed himself to see. The next day, he sent word to Iva requesting a private meeting. To his surprise, she agreed. They met at his office in town, just the two of them, no lawyers or witnesses. "You wanted to talk?" she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I know who you are," Clayton said quietly. "Violet's niece." Something flickered in Iva's eyes, surprise, then a hardening. "So you figured that out. Did she know? About your father, about the land?" She suspected. "Near the end, my mother told me she'd tried to visit Violet once, years after my father died. But she arrived just days after the funeral. She saw you there, cold as stone, already back to business. She decided not to reveal herself." Clayton absorbed this blow. "I loved Violet. Did you?" Iva's gaze was steady and merciless. "Because from where I stand, you've left a trail of dead and broken women behind you, Mr. Murn. And I'm here to make sure that trail ends." The land dispute went before Judge Ashford for a preliminary hearing. The judge was a careful man, not in Clayton's pocket but certainly aware of his influence. He reviewed both deeds, listened to arguments from both sides, and stroked his beard thoughtfully. "This is a complex matter," he said finally. "Miss Brix, your deed appears authentic and predates Mr. Murn's by 10 years. However, Mr. Murn has a legitimate claim based on the foreclosure sale and 20 years of continuous occupation. I'm going to need time to research the relevant case law. Full hearing in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Clayton was unaccustomed to waiting for anything. He'd built his life on decisive action, on getting what he wanted when he wanted it. Now he had to sit idle while his property rights hung in limbo and the whole territory watched to see if someone could actually beat Clayton Murn in a fight. The waiting gnawed at him. He threw himself into work, riding his property lines, reviewing his books, managing his business interests with obsessive attention. But at night, alone in his mansion, he found himself thinking about Iva Brix, about her calm certainty, about the way she'd looked at him when she said he'd left a trail of broken women. Was that true? He'd married in good faith each time. He'd tried to be a good husband, providing well, protecting his wives. It wasn't his fault that Margaret and Anne had died of natural causes, and Violet had been weak, susceptible to illness. He'd paid for the best doctors, done everything possible. But had he loved them? Really loved them? The way a husband should? He couldn't honestly say he had. He'd cared for them in his way, but there had always been distance. He'd never let them truly close, never shared his deepest thoughts or fears. He'd kept part of himself locked away, protected behind walls he'd built after his own father had died, and left him alone at 17 to make his way in a hard world. One evening, he encountered Iva at the church social. The whole town was there for a harvest celebration, and he'd felt obligated to attend, even though he usually avoided such gatherings. Iva was helping serve pie, laughing at something Temperance had said. She looked different when she laughed, younger, lighter, the hard edges softened. It struck him that she was handsome in her weathered way, strong features, clear eyes, capable hands. A woman who'd survived hardship and come through it with dignity and tact. When she noticed him watching, her expression shuttered. She turned away and busied herself with coffee cups. Later, as people were leaving, he found himself walking beside her down the dark street toward the boarding house. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Iva broke the silence. "I suppose you're wondering why I really came here. I know why. The land, justice for your father. That's part of it." She stopped under a street lamp, its yellow glow casting shadows on her face. "But there's more. My mother spent her last 2 years consumed with bitterness about what happened to our family. It ate at her, Mr. Murn. She died angry and sad, still holding grudges 40 years old. I watched it poison her. And you want revenge. I wanted to understand. I wanted to see for myself the man who'd caused so much pain. I wanted to know if you were the monster my mother made you out to be, or if there was more to the story. And what have you decided? Iva studied him carefully. I've decided you're neither a monster nor a saint. You're a man who made hard choices and some bad ones, who built something impressive but paid a price for it. You're lonely, Mr. Murn. Lonelier than anyone should be. And you don't even see it. The observation struck too close to home. Clayton felt his defenses rise. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. I've been watching you for 3 weeks now. You go through the motions of living, but you're not really alive. You're just existing in this cage you've built for yourself. This from a woman who lives alone in the mountains. At least, I chose my solitude. You had it forced on you by your own inability to let anyone in. She started walking again. Good night, Mr. Murn. He stood under the lamp long after she'd gone inside, her words echoing in his head. That night, he climbed to the attic of his mansion, something he rarely did. The space was full of old trunks and forgotten furniture, dusty with neglect. He found what he was looking for in a cedar chest. Violet's things, packed away after her death. Her clothes, her jewelry, her personal papers. He sat on the floor, surrounded by memories he'd tried to bury, and opened her journal. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart. But a pattern emerged as he read. Violet had been unhappy, not desperately so, but quietly, persistently sad. She wrote about feeling invisible, about Clayton's kindness that never quite became warmth, about wanting children he never seemed ready to have. One entry, dated a month before her death, stopped him cold. I think of Louisa often now. She ran away to marry for love, and our family cast her out. I married for security and respectability, and I find myself wondering which of us made the better choice. At least, Louisa had love, even if briefly. What do I have? A grand house and a husband who looks through me as if I'm made of glass. Clayton closed the journal with shaking hands. He'd failed Violet. He'd failed all of them, not through cruelty but through absence. He'd been so focused on building his empire that he'd forgotten to build a life. The next morning, he did something unprecedented. He went to the boarding house and asked Temperance if Iva would join him for breakfast at the hotel dining room. Iva arrived looking surprised but guarded. They sat across from each other in the nearly empty dining room, morning lights slanting through tall windows. "Why did you invite me here?" she asked. "I read Violet's journal last night. She was your aunt, and she was unhappy with me. You were right about that." Iva's expression softened slightly. "I didn't want to be right, Mr. Murn. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to find out you'd been a good husband, that my mother's bitterness was misplaced. It wasn't misplaced. I failed Violet. I failed the others too, in different ways. I've spent 30 years building walls and calling it strength. But it's not strength. It's fear. Fear of what? Of losing people, of caring too much and having it ripped away." He met her eyes directly. "My father died when I was 17. Worked himself to death trying to keep our small ranch afloat. I watched him collapse in the barn, watched the light go out of his eyes. I swore I'd never be that vulnerable again, never care so much about anything that losing it would destroy me. So you built an empire but kept everyone at arm's length. Yes, and now I'm 58 years old, rich as Midas, and completely alone. You were right about that too." Iva was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "I didn't come here to hurt you, Mr. Murn. I came for truth, for resolution. Maybe for both of us. It was the first real connection they'd made, a crack in the walls both of them had built." Clayton felt something shift inside him. something he couldn't quite name. Clayton began his own investigation into the past, not through hired detectives but through his own memory and the town's records. He needed to understand the full scope of what he'd done, not just to the Brix family but to others along the way. He started with Thomas Brix. The young man had worked for him in 1847, just 6 months before Clayton had fired him. Clayton pulled out old payroll records, tried to remember details. Thomas had been hard-working, honest, well-liked by the other hands. When tools went missing from the tack room, Clayton had needed someone to blame, and Thomas had been convenient new, without deep roots in the community, easy to cast out. 2 years later, a drifter passing through had gotten drunk and confessed to the theft. He'd been working odd jobs at the ranch that same summer, sleeping in the barn. He'd taken the tools and sold them in the next town. By then, Thomas Brix was long gone, his reputation destroyed, his life with Louisa Bridger already unraveling. Clayton had heard about the confession, but had done nothing. Thomas was gone, the matter was settled, and admitting error would have made him look weak. So he'd let the truth stay buried and moved on with his life. Now, sitting with the old records spread before him, he felt the full weight of that choice. An innocent man had been ruined because Clayton couldn't admit a mistake. And that man's wife, Louisa Bridger, had been Violet's sister. He found an old photograph in Violet's things, one he'd forgotten about. 2 young women standing together, arms linked, smiling at the camera. The resemblance was clear, both had the same strong features, the same direct gaze. Violet and Louisa sisters before everything fell apart. He studied Louisa's face in the photograph and saw echoes of Iva, the same determined set to the jaw, the same fearless eyes. Iva looked like her mother, carried herself the same way. And she'd spent her whole life hearing stories about the man who'd destroyed her family. That evening, Clayton did something he hadn't done in years. He visited Sheriff Tom Brennan at home, not on business but to talk. Tom was surprised, but welcomed him in. They sat on Tom's front porch with coffee, watching the sun set over the valley. "You've known me a long time, Tom," Clayton said. 20 years at least, 23 this spring. In all that time, have I been a fair man? Tom considered the question carefully. He'd kept his badge through Clayton's influence, and both men knew it. But he was honest in his way. "You've been fair by your own lights. You keep your word, pay your debts, enforce your rules. But fair by whose standard? That's a harder question." "What do you mean?" "You've always had the power in this town. When you decide something, it happens. That's not necessarily fair, it's just how things are. Some folks benefit, some don't. But you've never asked whether your version of order is what people actually want." Clayton absorbed this. "The town's prospered under my watch." "It has, but prosperity isn't the same as freedom. People don't challenge you because they can't afford to, not because they think you're always right." "Is that what you think? That I'm a tyrant?" "I think you're a man who got powerful and forgot how to be questioned. That can happen to anyone." Tom set down his coffee cup. "This thing with Iva Brix, it's shaking people up. Not in a bad way, necessarily. Folks are starting to wonder what else might be questioned, what else might change." Clayton rode home slowly, thinking about Tom's words. He'd built 4 stones into a prosperous town, yes, but had he ever asked what the people actually wanted? Or had he simply imposed his will and called it leadership? The next day he encountered Iva at the cemetery. She was standing before Violet's grave, one hand resting on the headstone. Clayton approached, quietly, not wanting to startle her. "I come here sometimes," Iva said without turning. "Talk to her. Tell her about my mother, about the mountains, about why I came down. What do you tell her about me? That you're more complicated than my mother made you sound. That maybe there's a reason things happened the way they did, even if the outcome was still wrong." She turned to face him. "My mother never forgave you." But she never forgave herself either, for marrying against her family's wishes, for the hard life she gave my father. Bitterness just breeds more bitterness. Is that why you're really here? To break the cycle? Partly. Also because I'm tired, Mr. Murn. I'm 50 years old, and I've spent most of my life alone in the mountains. My mother's dead. My grandmother's dead. My father's been gone 40 years. The land is all I have left of them. I want it back not for revenge, but for connection. Does that make sense? It did, more than Clayton wanted to admit. I have land, money, power, everything I thought mattered. But I don't have connection either. I built an empire and forgot to build a life. They stood together in the cemetery, two lonely people beginning to see each other clearly. Finally, Iva said, "The hearing is in 3 weeks. Whatever Judge Ashford decides, it's not going to solve what's really wrong. The land isn't the point anymore. Then what is? Truth, acknowledgement, maybe forgiveness, if we can find our way to it." Clayton looked at Violet's grave, then at the other 2 headstones nearby. Margaret, Anne, Violet, 3 women he'd married but never fully loved, 3 chances at connection he'd squandered because he was too afraid of loss to risk real intimacy. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. "Forgiveness, connection, all of it. I've spent 30 years being hard because I thought that's what survival required. Maybe it did, when you were younger. But you're not young anymore, and neither am I. Maybe it's time we learn different ways to survive." She walked away, leaving him with the dead wives and the growing realization that everything he'd built might not be worth the cost of building it. That night, Clayton sat in his study and wrote something he'd never written before, an apology. He addressed it to Thomas Brix, though the man had been dead for decades. He detailed his mistake, acknowledged the false accusation, admitted he'd known the truth and done nothing. He didn't know what he'd do with the letter, but writing it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. The next Sunday, after church, he stood before the congregation and made an announcement that shocked everyone. He was establishing a fund to help families who'd been wronged by improper business practices in the town's history. Any legitimate claims would be investigated and addressed. It wasn't specifically about the Brix family, but everyone understood what had prompted it. Iva was in the back pew. Their eyes met across the crowded church, and she gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Not approval exactly, but recognition that something was changing. After the service, several people approached Clayton, some to thank him, some to ask questions, some just to stare in disbelief. The most powerful man in 4 Stones had just admitted the possibility of wrongdoing. It was unprecedented. Temperance, Sloane stopped him on the church steps. "That took courage, Clayton, more than people might think. Or stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing. But you did right." She glanced back at Iva, who was talking with some of the church women. "She's good for you, you know. She's my adversary in a legal dispute. She's a mirror, showing you what you've become. That's a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one." Clayton walked back to his empty mansion, but for the first time in years, the emptiness felt like something he could change rather than something he had to endure. The town began to shift in subtle ways. Clayton's admission of past wrongs, vague as it was, had cracked something open. People started talking more freely about old grievances, old injustices, not in anger particularly, but with the relief of finally being able to speak truths that had been suppressed. 3 families came forward with claims against the compensation fund Clayton had established. One involved a disputed property line from 15 years back. Another concerned wages that had never been fully paid to a deceased worker's widow. The third was about water rights that Clayton had diverted to his advantage. He investigated each claim personally, reviewed the records, and found that all 3 had merit. He settled them fairly, which cost him money but earned him something he'd never had before, grudging respect mixed with genuine surprise. Meanwhile, his relationship with Iva developed in unexpected ways. They fell into a pattern of encountering each other around town, at the Tint Mercantile, at the post office, at community gatherings, and these encounters gradually became less accidental. They started having real conversations, not about the land dispute, but about other things. Books they'd read, places they'd seen, philosophies of life. Iva had been educated beyond what her mountain upbringing might suggest. She'd spent those missing years, the ones Marcus Webb couldn't account for, at a mission school in Montana Territory, teaching native children while learning from them in turn. She spoke a little Salish, could read Latin, and had studied natural philosophy from books donated by Eastern benefactors. "Why did you leave the mission?" Clayton asked one afternoon. They were sitting on a bench outside the mercantile, ostensibly resting in the shade, but really just talking. "They wanted me to take vows, become a sister. I couldn't do that. I believed in the work, but not in binding myself to an institution." She smiled slightly. "I'm not good at taking orders from authority. I noticed. My grandmother needed me anyway. She was getting older, having trouble managing on her own in the mountains. So I went back, took care of her for 18 years until she passed. That must have been lonely." It was, but it was also peaceful. The mountains teach you things that towns can't. Patience, acceptance, the understanding that you're small and the world is large. That's a good thing to know. Clayton thought about his own life, which had been dedicated to becoming large, to making himself too important to ignore. "I never learned those lessons. You could still learn them. You're not dead yet." He laughed, surprising himself. "Is that your standard for potential growth? Not being dead? It's a low bar, but it's achievable." These conversations felt like water on parched ground. Clayton realized he hadn't really talked, about ideas and feelings rather than business and strategy in decades. Probably not, since he was young and still believed the world was full of possibilities rather than problems to be managed. One evening, a summer storm rolled through the valley, and Clayton found himself stranded at the church after a town council meeting. Iva was there too, having helped organize the church library. Rain hammered on the roof and lightning lit the windows. They sat in the sanctuary, just the two of them, waiting for the storm to pass. The space felt intimate in the dim light, full of shadows and the smell of old wood and candle wax. "Can I ask you something personal?" Iva said. "You can ask. I might not answer. Why did you keep proposing to women after the first 3 died? Most men would have taken it as a sign." Clayton was silent for a long moment. "I thought marriage was what you were supposed to do. Build a home, have a family, create stability. I kept trying because I thought eventually I'd get it right. But you never loved any of them." "I tried to. I genuinely tried. But something in me couldn't open up that way. Every time I started to feel too much, I'd pull back. I'd find reasons to keep distance. You were protecting yourself. I was being a coward. Those aren't always different things." Iva turned to face him. "I've never married. Never even came close. I told myself it was because I lived in the mountains, because there weren't opportunities. But the truth is I was afraid too. Afraid of ending up like my mother, bitter and broken over a man who betrayed her. So I stayed alone and told myself it was a choice." Was it? Partly. But partly it was fear disguised as independence. Thunder rolled across the valley, and they sat in companionable silence. Finally, Clayton said, "What happens after the hearing? If you win? If you get your land back?" "I don't know. Build a cabin, I suppose. Live up there. Maybe guide hunters again, maybe just exist quietly. Alone? Probably. That's what I'm used to. It doesn't have to be that way." Iva looked at him sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure. I'm just thinking out loud." He met her gaze. "We're both lonely, Iva. We're both carrying old wounds, Maybe there's a different way forward than each of us, going back to our separate isolations. You want to be friends? After everything? I want to try. I want to see if two damaged people can find some kind of peace together. She studied him for a long moment. That's the most honest thing you've said since I met you. I'm trying to be more honest. You've taught me that much. The storm passed, and they walked through wet streets back to the boarding house. At the door, Iva paused. I'll think about what you said. About the future. About not being alone. But Clayton, if we're going to have any kind of relationship, even friendship, you need to face all of it. Not just the mistakes you've made, but why you made them. The hearing is going to bring up things you don't want to remember. I know. And you need to be prepared for what I might find. Because I'm still digging, still looking for truth. Some of it might hurt worse than what you already know. A cold feeling settled in Clayton's stomach. What are you talking about? I'll tell you when I'm sure. But there are gaps in the story, things that don't quite add up about Violet's death, about your other wives. I'm not accusing you of anything. Not yet. But I need to know the whole truth before I can think about any kind of future. She went inside, leaving Clayton standing in the damp street with a growing sense of dread. What else was buried in his past? What other sins had he committed and then conveniently forgotten? He walked home through puddles, reflecting lamplight, the taste of fear sharp on his tongue. Iva spent the next week in the county records office, going through documents with methodical precision. She was looking for something specific, though she hadn't told Clayton what. The clerk, Henry Walsh, helped her navigate the filing system, pulled dusty ledgers from high shelves, and watched with growing curiosity as she made notes. On the 5th day, she found it. A marriage certificate dated the 14th of June, 1846. Clayton Murn and Louisa Bridger, married by a circuit preacher named Reverend Samuel Cole, witnessed by two names she didn't recognize. The ceremony had taken place in a small chapel outside of town, recorded in a ledger that had been misfiled and forgotten. Iva stared at the document, her heart pounding. Her mother had been married to Clayton Murn, not to Thomas Brix first, as she'd always believed, but to Clayton, which meant everything she'd been told about her family's history was wrong. She requested the annulment records next. Henry found them in a different file, a petition filed 3 weeks after the marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. Both parties had signed. The annulment had been granted quickly, quietly, with minimal record. But there was something else in the Brund file, a letter from Louisa's father to Clayton, dated 2 days before the annulment was filed. Eva's hands shook as she read it. Mr. Murn, I am prepared to offer you the sum of $800 and a letter of introduction to the Denver banking interests on the condition that you agree to annul your marriage to my daughter and leave her alone. Louisa made a foolish choice in marrying beneath her station. I am willing to compensate you for the inconvenience and provide you the means to better yourself, but you must agree never to contact her again. If you accept these terms, come to my office tomorrow at noon. $800 in 1846 would have been a fortune to a young ranch hand, and a letter of introduction to Denver bankers would have been the key to everything Clayton had built. His entire empire had started with capital from somewhere she'd always wondered where. Now, she knew. He'd sold his marriage to her mother for seed money and connections. Iva copied everything, paid Henry for the copies, and walked out into bright sunlight, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her mother hadn't run away with Thomas Brix in defiance and heartbreak. She'd been betrayed by her husband, cast aside for money, and then found love with Thomas only after her marriage to Clayton had ended. Which changed everything about the story Iva had grown up believing. She went directly to Clayton's office. He was reviewing contracts when she walked in without knocking. One look at her face told him something significant had happened. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "What did you find?" She placed the marriage certificate on his desk. He stared at it, all color draining from his face. "You were married to my mother," Iva said, her voice eerily calm. "You didn't just fire my father and steal our land. You were married to her first." Clayton couldn't speak. His mouth opened, closed, no words coming. "When were you going? To tell me?" Iva demanded. "Were you going to let me find out in court? Let it come out in front of everyone?" "I didn't think I didn't remember." He stopped, knowing how pathetic that sounded. "You didn't remember marrying my mother? You didn't remember trading that marriage for $800 and business connections?" The letter. She'd found the letter. Clayton felt the room tilt. "Iva, let me explain." "Explain what? That you loved my mother and then sold her for money? That everything you've built came from betraying her?" It wasn't like that. But even as he said it, he knew it was exactly like that. We were young. I was 22, working for her father, barely making wages. Louisa and we fell in love, or thought we did. She wanted to defy her family, marry for passion instead of status. You wanted her father's money. No. At first, no. I married her because I loved her, because she was beautiful and fierce, and I thought we could build something together. He stood, moved to the window, couldn't look at Iva directly, but her family cut her off immediately. We had nothing. I was trying to support a wife on ranch hand wages, and it wasn't working. We were living in a one-room cabin, eating beans and cornbread, and Louisa was starting to realize what she'd given up. "So you made a deal." Her father made me an offer. He said Louisa would be miserable married to a poor man, that I was ruining her life. He offered me enough money to start over, to become something better. He said if I really loved her, I'd let her go back to her family where she belonged. "And you took the money." "I took the money." The admission tasted like ash. I told myself I was doing it for her, that she'd be better off. But the truth is, I was terrified. I'd seen what poverty did to my parents, how it ground them down. I didn't want that life. So I took the deal and told myself I was being practical. And Louisa, she was devastated. He expected her to go back to her family, but she refused. She said they'd betrayed her, and so had I. She left town entirely. I heard later she'd married Thomas Brix, that they'd gone to the mountains. I figured she'd moved on, forgotten about me. She never forgot. She never forgave either. Iva's voice was hard. She spent the rest of her life telling me about the heartless cattle baron who destroyed our family. But she never told me she'd been married to you. Why? Shame, probably. She didn't want you to know she'd been foolish enough to marry me, to believe in me. Iva sank into a chair, the fight draining out of her. This changes everything. The land claim, the history, all of it. You weren't just my father's enemy. You were my mother's first husband. I know. Did Violet know? Clayton nodded slowly. She found out, near the end. She was going through old papers, found the annulment records. She asked me about it. I told her it had been a brief, foolish marriage when I was young. I didn't tell her Louisa was her sister. I didn't make that connection until much later. But I think Violet suspected. Is that why she was so unhappy? Partly. She realized she'd married a man who'd already failed at marriage once, who'd traded love for ambition. And she saw that I was doing the same thing with her, providing well, but never really opening my heart. Iva stood and walked to the window, staring out at the town. I came here thinking I knew the story. Evil cattle baron ruins innocent family. But it's more complicated than that. You were young and stupid and scared. You made a terrible choice that had ripples you couldn't predict. Does that make it better or worse? I don't know. She turned to face him. What I do know is that this changes the legal situation completely. If you were married to my mother, if that marriage was annulled improperly, or if there are questions about the settlement, then your subsequent marriage to Violet could be invalid. And if your marriage to Violet was invalid, then all the property transfers based on that marriage are questionable. Clayton felt his empire crumbling. What are you going to do? I don't know that either. I need time to think. She moved toward the door, then paused. Did you love her? My mother? Even a little? I did. For a brief time, I loved her completely. It was the last time I let myself feel that much for anyone. And you've spent 40 years punishing yourself for it. She left, and Clayton collapsed back into his chair. The weight of the past pressed down on him, all the choices he'd made, all the consequences he'd tried to outrun. They'd finally caught up with him, and he had no defense except the terrible honesty that yes, he'd done it all, and he'd known exactly what he was doing. That evening, he sat in his study and wrote a letter to the judge, disclosing everything. The marriage to Louisa, the annulment, the payment from her father, the connection to Violet. He didn't know what the legal implications would be, but he was done with secrets. He was done with being the man he'd been for 40 years. Whatever came next, it would start with truth. Iva disappeared for 3 days. She left a note with Temperance saying she needed time alone, then rode up into the mountains with her bedroll and provisions. Temperance delivered the note to Clayton, who read it with a mixture of relief and anxiety. At least she hadn't left permanently. At least she was coming back. During those 3 days, Clayton did something he'd never done before. He waited without trying to control the outcome. He didn't send men to track her. He didn't try to influence the legal proceedings. He simply sat with the uncertainty and let it teach him what it would. He also went through his mother's things, stored in the attic alongside Violet's belongings. His mother had died when he was 12, his father 5 years later. He'd locked away their memory along with so much else. Now he opened the trunk that held her letters, her Bible, her small treasures. In the Bible she'd written notes in the margins. Verses about forgiveness, about redemption, about the difference between justice and mercy. On the flyleaf, in her careful handwriting, for Clayton, remember that strength without compassion is just hardness, and hardness makes you brittle. Better to bend than to break. Love, Mother. He'd been 17 when she wrote that, already developing the rigid spine that would carry him through life. She'd seen what he was becoming and tried to warn him. He hadn't listened. Now, at 58, he finally understood what she'd meant. On the 3rd evening, Iva returned. She came directly to his mansion, dusty from the trail, her face weathered by wind and sun. Mrs. Talbot showed her into the study where Clayton was reading his mother's letters. "You look like you've been wrestling with ghosts," Iva said. "I have been. My own, mostly." She sat down, across from him, and he poured her whiskey without asking. She accepted it, drank, and set the glass down carefully. "I found my mother's journal," she said. The complete one, not just the entries I'd read before. She kept it hidden in a hollowed-out book. I went back to our old cabin, dug through what was left. Clayton waited, knowing this was important. "She wrote about you, about the marriage, about what happened after." Iva pulled a worn leather journal from her pack and opened it to a marked page. "May I read you something?" He nodded, his throat tight. Iva read in a steady voice. "I have spent 30 years hating Clayton Murn for what he did, but I am old now and tired of carrying this weight. I think I finally understand that he was young and terrified, that he made a choice I would not have made, but one I can now see the shape of. He was raised in poverty, watched it kill his parents. When my father offered him a way out, he took it not because he didn't love me, but because he loved survival more. I cannot call that evil, only human and sad." She turned a page. "I followed Clayton's life from a distance all these years. I know he married my sister Violet. I know she died unhappy. I know he has tried and failed at love repeatedly. Part of me took satisfaction in that I thought it was justice, but now I see it is just more sadness, more waste. I wanted him punished, and he has punished himself more thoroughly than I ever could. I wish I could tell him that I understand now, that I forgive him, that he should stop running from the past and learn to live in whatever time he has left. Iva closed the journal. She wrote that, 6 months before she died, she was planning to come down from the mountains one more time to find you and tell you this in person. But the sickness took her first. Clayton's eyes were wet. She forgave me. She did, and she wanted you to forgive yourself. I don't know how. Neither do I, entirely. But I think it starts with accepting what happened, all of it, without trying to justify it or hide from it. You made a terrible choice 40 years ago. You've spent your life trying to outrun the consequences. But you can't outrun yourself, Clayton. None of us can. They sat in silence while the evening darkened outside. Finally, Clayton said, "What do you want to do about the land? About the legal case?" "I've been thinking about that. The land matters less than I thought. What matters is that the truth gets told, that the record gets corrected. I want it known that my mother was wronged, that my father was innocent, that the Bridger family had rights that were violated, but I don't need to destroy you to achieve that." "What are you proposing?" "A settlement. You acknowledge publicly what happened, the marriage, the annulment, the false accusation against my father, the improper foreclosure. You deed the high country parcel back to me as it should have been all along. And you establish a fund in my parents' names to help families who've been similarly wronged. I've already started that fund. Then expand it. Make it substantial. Make it mean something." She leaned forward. "And Clayton, you need to let go of control of this town, not all at once, but gradually. Let other people have a say in how things are run. Stop being the king and become just a citizen. That's asking a lot. It's asking you to be human instead of a monument. I think you're ready for that." Clayton thought about it. Everything in him resisted the idea of giving up control, of admitting weakness, of allowing others to make decisions that might not align with his vision. But everything in him was also exhausted from the weight of ruling alone for so long. If I do this, if I settle, acknowledge everything publicly, step back from power, will you stay? In 4 stones, I mean. Why would I stay? Because I'm asking, because I think we could help each other figure out how to be human. Again, he met her eyes directly. I'm not proposing marriage, Iva. I'm not even sure I'm proposing romance. I'm proposing companionship between 2 people who've both been alone too long and might be better together than apart. That's the strangest offer I've ever received. It's the most honest one I've ever made. Iva stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of 4 stones spread below. I need to think about it, but first we need to get through the hearing. We need to do this publicly, properly, so everyone knows the truth. Agreed. And Clayton, whatever happens between us personally, you need to do the right thing, because it's right, not because you're trying to win me over. I know. She left, and Clayton sat alone with his mother's letters and his dead wife's journal and the growing understanding that redemption wasn't something you earned in a single grand gesture. It was something you built slowly, choice by choice, day by day, in the wreckage of what you'd been. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Clayton spent those days preparing not his legal defense, but his confession. He wrote out everything in careful detail: the marriage to Louisa, the payment from her father, the annulment, the false accusation against Thomas Brix, the improper foreclosure on the Bridger land, his marriage to Violet without disclosing his connection to her family. He showed the document to his lawyer, who blanched. Clayton, this is you're destroying yourself. You don't have to admit all of this. Yes, I do. But the legal exposure, you could lose everything. I've already lost everything that mattered. Now I'm trying to find out if I can get some of it back. He also met with the town council and announced his intention to step back from active leadership. He would remain on the council as one voice among several, but he would no longer hold veto power over decisions. He would no longer expect deference simply because of his wealth. The council members stared at him in shock. Sheriff Tom Brennan finally broke the silence. "Clayton, are you ill? Is something wrong?" "Something's been wrong for 30 years, Tom. I'm just finally trying to fix it." Word spread through town quickly. By the time the hearing arrived, every seat in the courthouse was filled, and dozens more people stood outside trying to hear through the open windows. This wasn't just about a land dispute anymore. This was about the most powerful man in the territory, publicly accounting for his past. Judge Ashford gavelled the hearing to order. He looked at the packed courtroom with grave eyes. "This case has taken on significance beyond a simple property dispute. I understand both parties wish to make statements before we proceed to the legal arguments. Mr. Murn, Miss Brix, are you prepared?" Clayton stood. His legs were steady, but his heart raced. This was it, the moment where he either freed himself from the past or destroyed himself trying. "Your Honor, I have a statement to make. With the court's permission, I'd like to read it into the record." "Proceed." Clayton unfolded his written confession and began to read. His voice was clear and steady, but inside he was trembling. He told it all, every mistake, every betrayal, every moment of cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. The courtroom fell silent as a tomb, everyone listening to the most powerful man they knew systematically dismantle his own reputation. When he finished, he folded the paper and looked directly at Iva. "I cannot undo the past. I can only acknowledge it and try to make amends. The land in question rightfully belongs to Miss Brix through her mother's family. I'm prepared to deed it to her immediately, along with financial compensation for 40 years of lost use. I'm also establishing the Louisa and Thomas Brix Memorial Fund with an initial endowment of $50,000 to address similar historical wrongs, and I'm formally apologizing to the Brix and Bridger families for the harm I caused." He sat down. The silence stretched out. Then Iva stood. Iva faced the courtroom with her weathered hands clasped in front of her. She looked at Clayton, then at Judge Ashford, then at the crowd of townspeople who'd come to witness this reckoning. "Your Honor, members of this community, I came to 4 stones, seeking justice for wrongs done to my family. I found something more complicated than I expected. I found a man who'd made terrible mistakes, but who was capable of acknowledging them. That's rarer than you might think." She pulled out the old Bridger family Bible, the one with generations of births and deaths recorded in fading ink. She opened it to show the court. "This Bible belonged to my grandfather, Samuel Bridger. It records his acquisition of the land in 1851, his marriage, the births of his daughters Louisa and Violet. It shows our family's legitimate claim to the property Mr. Murn has occupied for 20 years. Judge Ashford examined the Bible carefully, noting the dates and signatures. "The provenance appears authentic. It is. But, Your Honor, I'm not here to take everything from Mr. Murn. I'm here to set the record straight and establish a path forward that honors the truth without perpetuating the cycle of harm." She outlined her proposal. Clayton would deed the high country parcel to her, acknowledge the historical wrongs publicly, and establish the memorial fund. In exchange, she would not pursue claims against his other properties or seek to invalidate his marriage to Violet retroactively, which could have thrown half the land titles in the county into chaos. "The law gives me the right to pursue maximum damages," Iva continued, "but justice isn't always about taking everything you can. Sometimes it's about finding a resolution that allows everyone to move forward." Murmurs ran through the courtroom. This wasn't the scorched earth revenge people had expected. It was something more measured, more thoughtful. A man stood in the gallery, Dutch Carmichael from the saloon. "Miss Brix, with respect, why should we trust Murn to keep his word? He's made promises before." "That's a fair question," Iva acknowledged. But I believe people can change. I've watched Mr. Murn these past weeks, seen him struggle with his past, seen him choose honesty, even when it costs him. That's not the behavior of a man who's playing games. Temperance Sloan stood next. I've known Clayton Murn for 25 years. He's been hard, controlling, often cold. But he's also been honest in his business dealings, and when he gives his word, he keeps it. If he's promising to make amends, I believe he'll follow through. Others spoke, some in support of the settlement, some still angry about past wrongs, some simply confused by this unprecedented display of public accountability. Judge Ashford let them speak, understanding this was about more than legal procedure. This was the community processing decades of grievances and power imbalances. Finally, the judge called for order. I've heard enough. The legal facts are clear. Miss Brix has demonstrated a prior claim to the property that predates Mr. Murn's purchase. The foreclosure that led to Mr. Murn's acquisition was procedurally flawed. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Miss Brix on the land claim. The courtroom erupted. Judge Ashford gavelled for silence. However, he continued, I'm also noting for the record Mr. Murn's willingness to make comprehensive restitution and his public acknowledgement of past wrongs. This court encourages the parties to finalize their proposed settlement. Mr. Murn, you will deed the property to Miss Brix within 30 days and establish the memorial fund as described. This court will monitor compliance. Clayton stood. Your Honor, I'd like to do more. I'm prepared to sign over an additional parcel adjacent to Miss Brix's land and fund the construction of a cabin, suitable for year-round habitation. I'm also proposing to establish a town council with genuine authority, independent of my influence. Judge Ashford raised an eyebrow. That's beyond the scope of this case, Mr. Murn. I know, but it's not beyond the scope of what's right. The judge considered this. Very well. Let the record show Mr. Murn's additional commitments. This hearing is adjourned. People flooded out of the courthouse, everyone talking at once. Some were angry that Clayton wasn't being punished more severely, others were moved by his admissions. Still others were simply trying to understand what this meant for the future of Four Stones. Clayton and Iva stood on the courthouse steps as the crowd swirled around them. Sheriff Tom Brennan approached and extended his hand to Clayton. That took guts, Tom said simply. Or stupidity, Clayton replied. Sometimes they're the same thing. Tom nodded to Iva. Welcome to Four Stones, Miss Brix. Officially this time, as... The crowd dispersed. Clayton and Iva were left standing together in the afternoon sun. The weight of decades had been lifted, but the path forward was still unclear. 3 days after the hearing, the town gathered again, this time not for conflict, but for transformation. Clayton had called a special meeting to formally establish the new town council and sign the property transfers in front of witnesses. The meeting hall was packed. Clayton stood at the front with a stack of documents, looking older somehow, but also more present, more real than he'd been in years. For 30 years, I've run this town like it was my personal property, he began. I told myself I was providing leadership, stability, order. But the truth is, I was afraid of losing control. I'd built everything on being the strongest, the richest, the most feared. And in doing that, I forgot how to be part of a community instead of ruling over one. He picked up the first document. This is the deed to 200 acres in the high country, transferred to Iva Brix as rightful heir to the Bridger family claim. It should have been hers all along. He signed it with a flourish and handed it to Iva, who stood beside him. Their hands touched briefly as she accepted the document, and something passed between them, acknowledgement, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. This, Clayton continued, holding up another paper, is the charter for the Four Stones Town Council. It establishes 7 elected positions with genuine authority over town affairs. I'll serve as one member if the people want me, but I'll have no more power than anyone else. Dutch Carmichael stood. And if we pass something you don't like, then I'll live with it, same as everyone else. Democracy is messy, but tyranny is worse, even benevolent tyranny. He signed the charter and passed it to Judge Ashford to witness. The judge reviewed it carefully, then nodded his approval. Finally, Clayton said, this is the founding document for the Louisa and Thomas Brix Memorial Fund. $50,000 to start, with an additional $10,000 added each year. The fund will be administered by a board of trustees elected by the community, not appointed by me. Its purpose is to investigate and remedy historical injustices in our town's past. Several people in the audience looked uncomfortable. Historical injustices meant their own families might have benefited from questionable land deals or unfair business practices, but others nodded in approval. Clayton signed the final document and set down his pen. That's all I have prepared. But before we adjourn, I want to say something personal. He looked out at the assembled townspeople, men and women he'd known for decades, whose lives he'd influenced for better and worse. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't know that I deserve it. But I am asking for a chance to be a better neighbor, a better citizen, a better man than I've been. I've wasted years building walls and calling it success. Whatever time I have left, I want to spend it differently. Temperance Sloan stood. I think I speak for many of us when I say, we've seen the change in you these past weeks, Clayton. It's not easy to admit mistakes, especially publicly. You've done that. Now we'll see if the actions match the words. That's fair, Clayton agreed. One by one, others spoke. Some expressed lingering anger and skepticism. Some offered cautious support. A few extended genuine forgiveness. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, something fundamental had shifted. Four Stones was no longer Clayton Murn's town. It was becoming its own place, with room for multiple voices and visions. As people filed out, many stopped to shake Clayton's hand or nod respectfully to Iva. The gesture felt significant, not quite absolution, but acknowledgement that change was possible. When the hall finally emptied, Clayton and Iva stood alone among the chairs and tables. He felt exhausted, but also lighter than he had in years. You did well, Iva said quietly. I didn't do anything except admit the truth. That's harder than most people ever manage. She held up the deed he'd signed. I'm going up to the high country next week. Start building a cabin before winter sets in. Will you help? Clayton looked at her in surprise. You want my help? I want to see if we can work together. Build something instead of tearing things down. If it works, maybe we continue. If it doesn't, at least we tried. That's not much of a guarantee. It's the only kind there is. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Clayton. You know that better than anyone. He smiled, a real smile, not the careful political expression he'd worn for years. When do we start? Saturday. Bring tools and be prepared for hard work. The mountains don't care about your money or your reputation. They only care about what you can actually do. I think I need that. We both do. They walked out together into the evening light, two people tentatively building a bridge across decades of pain and isolation. 6 months passed, like water over stone, slowly reshaping everything it touched. True to her word, Iva went up to the high country and began building. Clayton followed on Saturday with tools and lumber, expecting perhaps a day or two of symbolic labor before returning to his comfortable life. Instead, he found himself working week after week, learning to swing a hammer with precision, to fit logs together properly, to read the weather and adjust plans accordingly. The physical work changed him. His hands, which had grown soft from years of signing papers and shaking hands, developed new calluses. His back, which had begun to stoop from hours at a desk, straightened from lifting and carrying. His mind, which had been cluttered with financial calculations and power dynamics, cleared in the simple satisfaction of building something real. Iva worked beside him, not directing but collaborating. She knew the mountains, knew how to position a structure to withstand winter winds, knew which trees to cut and which to leave for windbreak. They developed a rhythm, working in companionable silence most of the time, talking occasionally about small things, the past gradually losing its grip as the present demanded their attention. The cabin took shape slowly. One room at first, with a stone fireplace and tight chinked walls, a porch facing south to catch winter sun, a small barn for horses. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and honest, built by their own hands. In town, changes rippled outward. The new town council held its first elections. Clayton ran for a seat and won, but barely. The vote was close enough to show that his influence had real limits now. He attended meetings as one voice among 7, and when the council voted against his position on water rights, he accepted the decision with grace he'd never shown before. The Brix Memorial Fund began its work, investigating old land claims and business disputes. 3 more families received compensation for past wrongs. Clayton paid each claim from his personal wealth, watching his fortune shrink without the panic he'd expected. Money mattered less than he'd thought. Purpose mattered more. People's attitudes toward him shifted gradually. The fear remained, for some old habits died hard, but it mixed now with cautious respect and, occasionally, genuine warmth. When his horse went lame during a winter storm and he had to walk 3 miles back to town, Dutch Carmichael drove out to pick him up without being asked. When Clayton caught a fever that laid him low for a week, Temperance Sloan brought soup and sat by his bedside, reading aloud from the newspaper. He was becoming part of the community instead of standing above it, and the sensation was both humbling and strangely liberating. His relationship with Iva deepened slowly, like roots finding purchase in rocky soil. They weren't lovers, both were too old and wounded for easy passion, but they were companions in the truest sense. They shared meals, shared work, shared the comfortable silences that come when 2 people no longer need to fill every moment with words. One spring evening, as they sat on the cabin porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Iva said, "Do you ever regret it? Giving up the power, the control?" Clayton thought about it honestly. Sometimes. Old habits whisper that I should be doing more, commanding more, owning more. But then I look at what I have now, this cabin we built, this friendship, the respect I'm slowly earning back, and I realize I'm richer than I ever was. That's a hard lesson to learn. Most of the important ones are. He looked at her profile against the shout, fading light. Thank you. For what? For not letting me hide from the truth, for demanding that I face what I'd done, for giving me a chance to become someone better. You did the work. Yourself, Clayton. I just held up a mirror. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, having someone who won't let you look away. They sat in silence as stars began to emerge. Down in the valley, lights flickered on in 4 stones. Clayton's mansion stood on the hill, still grand but no longer empty. He'd opened it to house the town's new school and library. His bedroom had become a reading room. His dining room was now filled with children learning their letters. It felt right, using what he'd built for something beyond himself. "I've been thinking," Iva said eventually, "that we should plant an orchard here next spring. Apple trees, maybe some cherries, something that will outlast us. An orchard takes years to produce fruit. We have years, not as many as we once did, but enough. And even if we don't live to see them fully grown, someone will. That's the point, building something that continues beyond yourself." Clayton reached over and took her hand. It was scarred and strong, a working hand that had seen hardship and endured. His own hand was changing too, becoming less polished, more real. "An orchard sounds good," he said. "We'll plant it together." In the distance, an owl called. The mountains held their silence, ancient and patient. 2 people sat on a small porch, no longer young, no longer pursuing the things they'd once thought mattered. They were building something different now, not an empire, not a fortune, but a life measured in simpler things: honest work, genuine companionship, the slow satisfaction of making amends. Clayton's old silver pocket watch sat on a shelf inside the cabin, still stopped at the moment Violet had died. But beside it now sat the new watch Iva had given him, its steady, ticking marking time that was finally moving forward again. Some people find love early and easily. Others have to travel through darkness first, learning the hard way what truly matters. Clayton Murn and Iva Brix were the second kind, but they'd found their way home, at last, not to a place, but to each other, and to the truth that sets all hearts free. The mountains watched, the stars turned overhead, and two people who'd spent their lives building walls finally learned how to build a bridge instead.